Welcome everybody to our fourth Aviation Reimagined webinar series that's coordinated and hosted by Griffith University. We've had around 380 people now register from all over the world, representing industry, airlines, airports, government, universities, consultancies, and lots of interested individuals. So thank you all for joining us today for the second webinar in this year's series. Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and are located for this meeting today. And for me, that's on the Sunshine Coast, which is known the traditional area of the Kabi Gabi people. We pay respect to elders, past and present, extending that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this is our second webinar of a 4-part series, and it runs every Thursday at 3 p.m. And this series builds on previous years, and we're going to put a link in the chat function for anyone who'd like to see the speakers and content from last year. I'm Emma Whittlesey, an associate with Griffith's Climate Ready Initiative, and I'm facilitating today's session with Professor Tim Riley from Griffith Aviation. Last week, if you could join us, we looked at the science and debunking some of the myths, and that was with Professor Paul Williams from the UK, looking at some of the consequences of climate change for aviation, such as flooding at airports, takeoff weight restrictions, flight times, and stronger turbulence. Professor David Lee, also from the UK, looked at CO2 and non-CO2 effects and their contribution to global warming, and also explored contrail generation. And Professor Brendan Mackey from Australia examined the efficacy of carbon offsets and SAF in the mission toward net zero. If you didn't get to join us, then please replay the session from our website. Today's session, we're looking at the policy environment and how the bar can be raised to drive decarbonisation in the aviation sector. Determining and mobilising effective policy and governance mechanisms to support decarbonisation and increased resilience of the aviation sector is challenging, not least because aviation strategies do not necessarily consider decarbonisation, and existing energy and broader transport strategies often do not consider the aviation sector. This can limit opportunities and can be counterproductive. So today we're going to explore existing and emerging policy approaches, programs and mechanisms that are needed for the transformation and what we can do to ramp up opportunity and impact. We're going to have 3 presentations, and at the end we're going to have a Q&A session. So please do post any questions for the speakers in the chat function as we go along. If they're for a particular speaker, please just note who it is for. A quick reminder that all of our sessions are recorded and you can access the links to the recordings online afterwards. So to make a start, I'm going to warmly welcome our first speaker, Rosalind van der Vlies, Director of Clean Planet, Director General for Research and Innovation from the European Commission in Belgium. So thank you very much for getting up so early to join us this morning. Rosalind is Director of the Clean Planet Directorate in the European Commission's Director General for Research and Innovation and Deputy Mission Manager of the Climate Neutral and Smart Cities Mission. Before her appointment, Ms van der Vlies was the Head of Coordination and Interinstitutional Relations Unit and Acting Head of Communications and Citizens Unit. Rosalind today is going to present on Europe's vision for climate neutral aviation. So I'm going to hand over now, thank you, to Rosalind. And Renan is going to share the slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and good afternoon, Australia. It's very early, well, not very early, but still a bit early in Europe. And it's my real pleasure and honor to be presenting to you today the European Commission's vision for climate neutral aviation. I would also like to thank and congratulate the Griffith Aviation Reimagined webinar series for bringing together such a very interesting agenda and speakers, and in particular a big thank you to Dr. Emma Whittlesey and Professor Tim Riley. I think this is really absolutely great stuff. And let me start with my first slide, where I really want to show how we are all connected in one planet, one world. And of course, it's very clear that CO2 emissions do not stop at national borders. And this is why it's so important that we all join forces and we all collaborate together. So if we move to the next slide, I don't need to convince anybody of the need to have this global approach to climate neutrality, and it's very clear that global aviation contributes in real numbers around 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent out of the around 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent of anthropogenic emissions. And therefore, global aviation is approximately responsible for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is growing around 2 to 3% per year. So at the top right, you have more statistics on how these aviation emissions are distributed between passengers and freight, international, domestic, as well as high and lower income countries. But what I really want to stress is the importance of international collaboration. And we in the European Union are extremely committed to eliminating the aviation emissions between European countries. But of course, we want to collaborate across the globe in order to make a real impact. So if we move to the next slide, I would like to talk you through a bit the European policies for emission reduction. And basically, we have three main building blocks for our pathway towards climate neutrality. The first building block is our political and strategic vision. And for us in the European Union, it is very important that we align the political agendas of all our European Union member states. So this is a big role for the European Commission because we are basically then guiding also the political and strategic visions of the individual European Union member states. And for us, it's very important to have a common political vision. So this is the first building block in our pathway to climate neutrality. The second building block is our regulatory framework. So the rules and regulations that exist in the European Union. And the third building block is, of course, that we also need massive investments. So I will talk you through these three main building blocks in the next slides to come. So starting with the strategic vision, our first strategic vision for Europe for climate neutrality is our European Green Deal. And with our European Green Deal, we've basically set ourselves on a pathway to become climate neutral, well, actually the first climate neutral continent in the world by 2050. And this European Green Deal strategy is not only our sustainability strategy, but it's also our growth strategy. So our strategy for competitiveness, and also it's a social strategy, because as part of the European Green Deal, we want to make sure that we leave no person, no region behind. So this is really an overarching strategy that is subscribed to by our member countries. Now, zooming in on aviation, we have developed aviation strategic research and innovation agendas. And this we have done together with our European aviation industry and our European aviation industry ecosystem. So we have been together with the European industry developing a common vision on where we need to invest and focus on when it comes to the research innovation agenda. And this has been a very powerful tool because with this we are really combining the financial investments that we are making at the European Union level in research and innovation together with a commitment from our industry, who are basically then contributing with what we call in-kind contributions. And then together for our financial frameworking program, we have kind of like a common strategic vision of where we need to focus on for our investments. So this is basically the first building block. Yes.
Sorry, we've got a blank screen. Did you want us to play a video? I think there's a video embedded in it.
Oh, yes, sorry. I didn't see the screen. Yes, if that's possible, yes, that's a good idea.
Okay, we'll play that video and then I'll let you carry on.
Europe wants to be the first climate neutral continent in the world. Even though the finish line is 30 years away, the race starts now. The 2020s is the make or break decade. And that's why Europe has committed to reduce our emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels.
Must guide our societies to a cleaner and healthier future. This transition will affect our daily lives, from the cars we drive, from the houses we live in, from the jobs we will have in the future. I'm confident that we can make it if we do two things. If we set ourselves a sound direction and stand together as a continent in mastering the challenge.
We are building a model for a clean economy that is also a prosperous economy, and both is doable.
So thanks, Rosalind. We'll go on to your next slide now. So I don't know if you can see the slides to catch up. Just let us know when you want us to move on.
Yeah, please, let's move to the next slide. So this is basically, as I said, the first building block, so the common strategic vision for the European Union. Then the second building block is to make sure that our rules, our laws are basically supporting the transition. So we basically have various pieces of legislation that also impact on the aviation sector to support the aviation sector in their green transition. And today I would like to highlight one very important piece of legislation that recently has been adopted by our European Council of Ministers that aims to decarbonize the aviation sector with a focus on increased use of renewable and low carbon fuels. So this is the Refuel EU Aviation Regulation. And there are various obligations that will become legally binding for the aviation sector. So, for example, there's an obligation for aviation fuel suppliers to ensure that all fuel made available to aircraft operators at EU airports contains a minimum share of sustainable aviation fuels from 2025, and from 2030 also a minimum share of synthetic fuels. And then these minimum shares will gradually increase until 2050. And then the idea is that as of 2050, there would be 70% of SAF, and the synthetic fuels rising to 35% by 2050. So there's also an obligation then for the aircraft operators to ensure that there is a yearly quantity of aviation fuel uplifted at a given EU airport, and that should be at least 90% of the yearly aviation fuel required. And this is to avoid tankering practices, which would bring additional emissions from the extra weight. And also the airports must guarantee, of course, that there will be the necessary infrastructure to deliver, store and refuel with sustainable aviation fuel. So this is just one example how we are basically ensuring that we have the appropriate regulatory framework in place to support the decarbonization of the aviation sector. I also would like to mention that as a novelty, we have included the aviation sector in the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And this is to ensure that aviation also contributes to the EU's emission reduction objectives. And we are also then ensuring that there will be a gradual phasing out of the current free emission allowances that existed to date for the aviation sector. And lastly, I would like to mention, this is still part of our second building block, the regulatory framework, that we also will start a monitoring, reporting and verification system for non-CO2 effects in aviation from 2025. So this is to pave the way also to regulate the non-CO2 emissions from aviation. So we will start with a monitoring, reporting and verification system, as I said, in 2025, but then we will start to prepare also for binding rules in this respect. So if we move on then to the third building block, which you also see reflected on the slide already, this is the massive investments that I was talking about. And here we have various European programs that invest in decarbonizing the aviation sector. The first program that I want to highlight is our European program for research and innovation called Horizon Europe. And I will not go into the details of how our program is organized, but I think it's important for the aviation sector to note that we have a partnership with the industry that I mentioned before, where from the Commission side we are investing 1.7 billion euros in order to roll out research and innovation projects and to ensure that we are co-investing with the industry in innovative solutions for the aviation sector. So if we go on to the next slide, I would like to focus a bit on the concrete projects that we are launching in the context of this partnership. So we have, as I said, we are investing 1.7 billion euros from the European Commission side, which is then topped up with an additional investment from the private sector in-kind contributions with another 2.4 billion euros. So we have basically three objectives that we want to achieve with our research and innovation investments in clean aviation. The first one is that we are working on a hybrid electric regional aircraft. And here we want to really demonstrate new technologies in order to have this hybrid electrical powered aircraft. The second innovations that we are investing in is to develop an ultra-efficient short and medium range aircraft, really focusing on efficiencies, improvements in fuel efficiency, and also to make sure that we can use in these aircraft the low or zero emission energy sources. And lastly, and this is really the flagship of our research innovation program, we are investing in a hydrogen powered aircraft for the short and medium range. So apart from our investments through the partnership in these various low or zero emission aircraft, we are also continuing our research into noise reductions and non-CO2 emissions. So on the slide, you see two examples of projects that we are investing in, so that you can really see that we are investing together with the industry in collaborative fundamental aviation research as well. So then if we move on to the next slide, this is really to underline the importance of international collaboration. Our framework program, Horizon Europe, is open to the world, so open to Australia, New Zealand as well. And I'm very happy that there are also particular sessions that we organized for Australia and New Zealand in particular. I'm also very impressed with the Australian aviation white paper. I think that Australia is doing an excellent job. And we have a lot of common grounds for future collaboration, in particular in the area of research and innovation, to explore more research and innovation opportunities on aviation, but also transport and energy research at large. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention and congratulate you again for organizing this very interesting webinar. And now back to you, Emma.
It's back to me as co-host. Thanks very much, Rosalind. Yeah, no, thanks very much. Professor Tim Riley here from Griffith University as well. That was a really interesting presentation on European policies and programmes, and a great start to this webinar session. And some insights there on what we can expect to see in the future. If you do have any questions for Rosalind, do post them in our Q&A. I can see a couple in there already. So Rosalind, yeah, when you get your breath back and you're ready, just feel free to respond to those two questions. And as we go through the other two, feel free, those attending, to put in some more questions, either generally or to a specific speaker. That would be fantastic. So we now move on to the next presentation. Our second speakers are joining us from New Zealand. So we've got Dr. Maylie Griffin and Cindy Park from the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment for New Zealand. So Maylie Griffin is a strategic partnership manager within the Innovative Partnerships team. Cindy Park is a graduate policy advisor within the Gas and Fuel Markets Policy team. So both of them work within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MBIE, which is one of the largest regulatory departments in New Zealand. They're going to present on the government's initiatives to address the decarbonisation of the aviation industry. So that includes Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa, that was launched in November 2022 as a private-public partnership that explores next-generation aircraft, sustainable aviation fuels, and regulatory requirements as three key work streams. So we look forward to hearing about this. So Maylie and Cindy will present on the New Zealand government's initiative for decarbonising aviation. So thanks very much to both of you, and it's over to you.
Awesome. So thanks so much. I hope you can hear me okay. So I really want to thank Griffith University for the opportunity to be part of this great webinar series that's running throughout October. And I have to say, I actually really enjoyed 3 presentations from last week's session with the professors. So as was said, my name's Maylie Griffin, and I work at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And my colleague, Cindy Park, and I will give a high-level overview of the New Zealand government's initiatives for decarbonising aviation. So MB is what we like to call it, is a public service department in New Zealand, and its role is to deliver policy, services, advice and regulation. There's a number of teams within the ministry's branches that are involved in projects to do with hydrogen, aerospace and sustainable aviation fuels. So the Innovative Partnerships Program, which is where I sit, works with international firms and New Zealand innovators to establish the environments necessary for adoption of New Zealand as an R&D location. So our focus is really on transformative technologies or emerging sectors that support the government's vision. We hold the aerospace strategy for government and have a portfolio that includes hydrogen for advanced aviation. We are also pursuing sustainable aviation fuels, which I'll talk more about later. We work with our colleagues in the Energy and Resource Markets branch, whose teams are responsible for providing policy and regulatory advice on energy markets. And that's to ensure our oil, gas, mineral and coal resources are effectively managed. So Cindy, my colleague, who you'll hear from later, sits in the Gas and Fuel Markets Policy team. The Just Transitions Partnerships team, which look to support the planning needed to ensure a just transition to a low emissions economy by 2050, has a key focus to ensure that regions in New Zealand are supported to plan and manage the social, economic and environmental impacts of a transition. And our tourism policy colleagues scan the tourism system to ensure current and future performance is considered in line with other environmental factors, insights and global trends to develop high-level policy framing. So the first thing I want to point out, though, is that New Zealand is in a relatively advantageous position in terms of our electricity generation, as around 82% is currently from renewable sources, mostly hydroelectric, along with wind and geothermal. And in the second quarter of last year, renewable sources provided 95% of our electricity generation. We have committed, like many countries, to ambitious targets to meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement. And this includes 100% renewable electricity system by 2030, 50% of our total energy from renewable sources by 2035, and achieving a net zero economy by 2050. So in May last year, the government published its emissions reduction plan, which set out the actions to meet the first emissions budget under the Zero Carbon Act. and it includes a circular and bioeconomy strategy. This strategy is currently under development and is expected to provide more clarity on the prioritised use of New Zealand's biomass. The New Zealand energy strategy is under development to support the transition to a low carbon economy, address strategic challenges in the energy sector, and signal pathways away from fossil fuels. The New Zealand waste strategy outlines considerations related to the circular use of materials and net greenhouse gas emissions reductions, which, to be honest, certain waste to energy projects might struggle to achieve. We also have the government's economic strategy, which is under the umbrella for the industry transformation plans, which includes tourism, forestry, and wood processing. And then the Ministry of Transport's Decarbonising Transport Action Plan 2022 to 2025, which has a goal to reduce transport emissions by 41% by 2035. So 2 key initiatives that specifically cover aviation were launched this year. So in June, the draft Tourism Environment Action Plan was launched. This plan comes under the broader tourism industry transformation plan. Now, key action in this plan is investment in finding low carbon fuel options. Aviation contributes up to 60% of tourism's emissions, and New Zealand's tourism industry, of course, relies on international flights to bring in our tourists, given that we're in an island. So the only way to get here really is by boat or plane. The government has invested $765,000 to co-fund 2 feasibility studies in partnership with New Zealand's national carrier, which is Air New Zealand, to investigate the feasibility of sustainable aviation fuel production in New Zealand. Along with this, the New Zealand aerospace strategy was launched 1 month later. This strategy includes goals specific to space, advanced aviation, and data to address the specific needs of each of these subsectors in the wider aerospace sector. Out of the 5 goals in the strategy, goal 1 is to build a sustainable air passenger journey by 2030. In 2021, MB and Air New Zealand entered an MOU with the purpose of determining the feasibility of a commercial scale SAF plant in New Zealand. In November the same year, MB supported Air New Zealand to run a closed request for proposals for pre-feasibility studies. 4 proposals were received from international SAF producers. These were considered by the evaluation team, which had representatives from Air New Zealand and cross-government officials from MB, Ministry of Transport, Ministry for the Environment, and Ministry for Primary Industries. The team was also supported by an independent specialist bioenergy consulting firm. So those phase 1 feasibility studies finished last year. Now, emissions reductions are the primary aim of producing SAF, and Air New Zealand established that SAF must provide a high level of emissions reductions as a critical outcome of any project. A decision was made to progress 2 of the proposals to a second stage of studies, those being from LanzaJet, which is a consortium of LanzaTech, LanzaJet, and Z Energy, and Fulcrum Bioenergy. Feedstocks of interest include forestry residue and organic material and certain unrecyclables that would otherwise go to landfill. Any plastics and other high-intensity carbon emissions products would not be included in the feedstock, as they're not going to meet our government's waste strategy. The first study to be undertaken is a comprehensive characterisation and evaluation of the feedstocks in New Zealand. Again, a panel of cross-government agencies as partners with Air New Zealand will be evaluating those studies against technical, economic, supply chain, and environmental aspects. SAF is seen as the only viable option for reducing emissions in long-haul flights in the coming decades. However, even if New Zealand does start producing SAF, we still see the need to supplement the domestic supply with imported SAF to meet demand for the foreseeable future. Now, both of these studies will kick off next month. So I'll hand over to Cindy now, my colleague, to talk through the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Molly. So, Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa. As an action under the government's emissions reduction plan, Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa was established at the end of last year as New Zealand's public-private leadership body focusing on decarbonising aviation. This body is similar to the UK's Jet Zero Council. New Zealand's Ministry of Transport is the lead agency for the SAA, but its members also include representatives from other government agencies, the Civil Aviation Authority, airlines, airports, and the Pilots Association. So some of the SAA's objectives are to provide industry leadership advice, to identify and optimize the strategic, economic, and international benefits for the industry, accelerate the commercial operation of zero emissions aviation systems in New Zealand, consider what regulations need reviewing to enable a smooth decarbonisation pathway for aviation, and establish government working groups to accelerate progress on decarbonising the aviation sector. The SAA is not a decision-making body, but it will drive advice on future policies to help the aviation sector decarbonise. Any recommendations or information put forward from the SAA will be considered by government officials, who will then advise ministers as appropriate. So there are 3 working groups in the SAA that are focused on 3 different work streams. One work stream looks at SAF with a particular focus on a SAF mandate and what it could look like in New Zealand. And the partnership between Air New Zealand and the government on the SAF feasibility studies will help inform this work stream, but it sits outside of this particular forum. Another working group is focused on zero emissions aircraft for short-haul flights, including electric and hydrogen. And the third group is a strategy work stream, which will be looking into regulation, infrastructure, and aviation emissions targets. This includes assisting the Climate Change Commission with their consideration of including international aviation emissions within our domestic targets. Coming back to the SAF mandate focus, the government is currently developing a discussion document on the proposed policy design of a SAF mandate, recognising that the right policy settings can help increase SAF demand in New Zealand. So what could a SAF mandate look like? SAF mandate would require all obligated parties in New Zealand to blend a set amount of SAF into their jet fuel annually, and targets would gradually increase each year. Again, we're developing a discussion document that sets out 3 key policy considerations for a SAF mandate in New Zealand. This includes asking who will be the obligated parties under the mandate, whether it be fuel suppliers or airlines, what the best way to set targets would be, either volumetric or emissions intensity reduction targets, and how we can ensure the sustainability of SAFs being used to meet the mandate. We could require SAFs to be assessed by sustainability criteria, or we could introduce feedstock limitations. And wider considerations include the economic impacts of the mandate. On one hand, there are high direct costs to the aviation sector to uptake SAF, but we also recognise that if domestic production occurs at scale, it would support regional development and the creation of high-value jobs. We also need to consider SAF's role in the wider decarbonisation efforts of the aviation industry, understanding that there is no silver bullet solution to aviation's decarbonisation and figuring out how increasing SAF uptake would fit into the bigger picture. We're expecting to release the discussion document for public consultation in the coming months. We also have an adjacent work stream that is developing a hydrogen roadmap. While the government is pleased to see the investment led by the private sector, we know there is more we can do to provide confidence and help steer the emerging hydrogen ecosystem while looking to meet our emissions reduction targets. The government is now looking to guide and give confidence through a hydrogen roadmap. The roadmap will set a clear signal of the government's policy objectives in the hydrogen market and outline the actions it will take to support those objectives. We're thinking carefully about the export and research and development opportunities offered through our partnerships with other countries. An interim roadmap was released this year with plans for a final roadmap published alongside our energy strategy by the end of 2024. I'll hand back to Marley to finish up.
Thanks, Cindy. So the government recognises there are a number of solutions on the table for decarbonising aviation, and we feel like we're in an and situation, not an or, meaning that we don't see any of the offerings on the table as a silver bullet, like Cindy said, but rather we should be investing in a range of energy solutions so it becomes SAF and battery and hydrogen. So New Zealand's really seen a flourishing hydrogen ecosystem emerging. There are a range of research and commercial partnerships across production, technology development, storage, refueling networks, aviation and road transport. Many of them are shown in this map from the New Zealand Hydrogen Council, which is an industry body here. So in March 2021, Auckland Transport unveiled its first hydrogen bus built by Global Bus Ventures in Christchurch. and Headinga Energy are building a refueling network for heavy transport. The spillover benefits from road transport's interest in hydrogen has created the opportunity for aviation in New Zealand to consider this as a fuel sooner than later. In January last year, the Ministry commissioned a feasibility study of placing a hydrogen hub at a New Zealand airport, which would play an important role in attracting offshore R&D of advanced hydrogen-powered aircraft to New Zealand for trialling and testing. The report highlights the need for key infrastructure to place a hydrogen hub at an airport, and this report is publicly available on MBIE's website, and I've put a link in this slide. At the same time, Air New Zealand is investigating its infrastructure requirements for hydrogen in aviation. In 2021, they released a product specification request for novel propulsion concepts as a kickoff to their work on lower emissions aircraft. They're also a partner in a hydrogen consortium alongside Christchurch International Airport, Airbus, Headinga, Fortescue Future Industries, and Fabrum. This joint initiative with Airbus includes researching how hydrogen-powered aircraft could be part of Air New Zealand's fleet by 2030. The hydrogen-powered engines will be developed in the airline's turboprop aircraft. Christchurch International Airport is leading the way in its decarbonisation journey, and it's installing a 300-hectare solar farm, which is expected to generate 150 megawatts of energy per year. It's also working on its infrastructure needs for producing and storing hydrogen next to the airport, which would enable both future aviation and ground transport to access it. And local company Fabrum has entered into a manufacturing partnership with Clean Power Hydrogen to supply membrane-free liquid hydrogen systems, which will see electrolyzers built in Christchurch, coupled with Fabrum's technology for storing liquid hydrogen. In August, Air New Zealand opened an expression of interest to airports around the country as part of selecting a route to fly its commercial demonstrator aircraft from 2026. The commercial demonstrator aircraft is yet to be selected, but it will either be electric, hybrid, or hydrogen fuel cell, and will initially operate as a cargo-only service. The airline is looking for airports motivated to develop the infrastructure required to fly this technology. We do believe New Zealand's uniquely placed to lead the world in deployment of next-generation aircraft due to the short-range domestic routes and our electricity network largely being built on renewable energy. So while the private sector is certainly charging ahead with some fantastic initiatives for aviation, I do want to touch on a program that includes an ever-growing market for uncrewed craft, with the vision that one day we may see autonomous air taxis. The Airspace Integration Trials Program, or what we call AITP, is run out of the team I'm in. Its vision is for New Zealand to be a location of choice for the safe development, testing, and market validation of advanced uncrewed aircraft. There are 12 partners in the program, and I won't go through them all, but I do want to touch on a couple. For example, Whisk Aero is an advanced air mobility company formed as a joint venture by the Boeing Company and Kitty Hawk Corporation. It's developing an autonomous electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft from urban air mobility, also known as a flying taxi. So the flying taxi was brought to New Zealand after a global search for an ideal test ground. Whisk was the first industry participant in our AITP program. We also have Dawn Aerospace. It's a space company headquartered in Christchurch, New Zealand. The company is developing an uncrewed suborbital space plane with rapidly reusable flight characteristics. We have Merlin Labs aiming for a fully autonomous aircraft. The Boston-based company has opened a test facility north of Auckland. It's using a pair of Cessna Caravan aircraft for flight testing as part of the process to achieve certification for the Merlin pilot system with New Zealand's Civil Aviation Authority. So the development of these types of aircraft in New Zealand saw a necessity to address the ability to resource certification of next-gen craft. The government enabled the establishment of the Emerging Technologies Unit within the Civil Aviation Authority to deal with applications from these type of craft. This helps pave the way for established commercial aviation who are also looking to the future of what aircraft will look like and how they will operate. So of course, there are multiple challenges with all of this. Unlike SAF, which is a drop in fuel, hydrogen, battery, or hybrid craft bring a whole set of challenges with them. There are refueling and recharging logistics, especially around the time to charge for battery craft and how to store and then fuel a craft with liquid hydrogen that's kept at cryogenic temperatures. There are safety challenges with hydrogen. Standards New Zealand, on behalf of WorkSafe New Zealand Energy Safety, has conducted a review of technical standards governing the production, distribution and use of hydrogen. In May this year, they released the Hydrogen Standards Review Report, and this is available online. There are feedstock risks in New Zealand as companies exploring the domestic production of alternative fuels look to a handful of possible feedstocks, and a technology risk that this is just all harder to do than we initially thought. There's also policy risks, but some mitigating factors include industry working closely with government, so we understand how to effectively use the suite of policy tools at our disposal, or at least as best we can. So that concludes our presentation today. And again, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you very much, Miley and Cindy, for joining us. That was extremely useful to learn about not just sustainable aviation at Aurora, but also the key work streams, next generation aircraft, sustainable aviation fuels, and the work around the regulatory requirements, and very progressive activity happening under each. So thanks for sharing that. We will ask those in the audience to please ask your questions for either Cindy or Miley in the Q&A, and we will be having the Q&A panel at the end. But our final speaker today is joining us from the USA. It's Graham Noyes, the Executive Director of the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition based in California. Graham's legal practice is devoted to fuel and carbon law, and Graham represents the Sustainable Aviation Fuels Producer Group, which includes many of the world's leading SAF companies, including Fulcrum Bioenergy, Gevo, LanzaJet, Velocis, and World Energy. Graham previously represented many of these same SAF producers in the coalition effort with A4A, United Airlines, and SFO Airport that secured California Air Resources Board approval for the crediting of SAF in California's low carbon fuel standard. So Graham today is going to present on the US federal and state incentive policies for SAF airport fueling hubs. So Graham, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Emma. Good evening, all from the foothills of Northern California here. My name's Graham Noyes, and we're going to be moving into what's really a different policy structure here in the U.S. in sort of contrast to what we've heard from the European approach and the New Zealand approach. And it's somewhat of a patchwork. So I just want to say that up front, and this is a fairly heavily loaded presentation that I'm going to be working through here with you. I would not expect all of it to be digested at one time, but hopefully it's going to be a good leave behind to cover some of the many programs that we have. And I'll say up front that one of the two of the key distinctions, I guess, number one is U.S. policy has been much more focused on the incentive side of things thus far, with much less on the mandate side. And number two, state level policies are very significant in the U.S., and we see competition between states in the way they are pursuing SAF out there. And as Emma mentioned, I lead up the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition, which is dedicated to low carbon fuel standards, which have played a really important role in the development of SAF. And we work to expand clean fuel policies at the state and federal level. We have many of our members who are very interested in the expansion of SAF policy, including Fulcrum, Gevo, Boeing, Amazon, UPS, a diverse membership that really sees the value of this policy structure that we'll talk about in some more detail as a way to move the needle forward in terms of SAF expansion. And then the other sort of focused work that I do in this area is with some of the companies that have already been mentioned out there. They're some of the world leaders in commercializing SAF, using different technologies. And this SAF producer group, we work to identify the best opportunities for additional state policies that are additive. And in particular, we look for the opportunities to stack as many policy structures on top of each other as possible to close what tends to be the biggest challenge out there, which is the price premium for a gallon of SAF as compared to a gallon of conventional jet fuel. And so with a combination of federal and state policies, we are rapidly closing that gap in some jurisdictions. And this group represents many different feedstocks and many different process technologies. So like the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition, we really look toward technology neutral policies and policies typically grounded in life cycle analysis, carbon intensity analysis. And I think that's one of the really major cross-cutting industry issues that we have that goes across all of the different jurisdictions here, is working to hopefully ultimately achieve some greater consensus around what carbon modeling should look like and what life cycle analysis should look like, and gain some additional support, particularly given the nature of the international nature of aviation, the importance of the CORSIA structure, and the fact that all of these airlines are operating across multiple jurisdictions. So in terms of just big picture wise, the types of policies that we have are quite distinct in terms of the sort of the oldest policy out there in this space and the most important biofuel policy in the U.S. has been the Renewable Fuel Standard, and that is a somewhat dated policy structure, frankly, but somewhat ahead of its time too, and has been very durable and important for moving SAF forward. Coupled with the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which has been a state level program so far, that's not established at the federal level in the U.S. State level tax incentives, and then we also have seen significant boosts in funding coming from the Inflation Reduction Act, both on the grant side and on the federal tax credit side. So just really quickly to introduce you to these policy structures, the Renewable Fuel Standard is to some degree a mandate in that it does have what are known as renewable volume obligations that are imposed on the obligated parties. The obligated parties are petroleum refiners and importers, and they have to meet the requirements in terms of these volumetric requirements based on their sales of fuels into the U.S. market. And there are a variety of different types of fuels that are categorized into what are known as RIN categories out there. So we think of that as a bucket policy. So you have to get the sufficient number of RINs in these different buckets. And if you don't have enough RINs, then you have to go out and buy those in the market. By contrast, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard policy is much more technology neutral and doesn't require renewable biomass, which is a component of the RFS. That's a component grounded in statute. And so in order to be an RFS compliant fuel, it's got to be renewable biomass based. In contrast to that, the state level low carbon fuel standards that exist now in California, Oregon, and Washington are based on carbon intensity reduction, life cycle analysis, and all fuels compete out there to achieve that life cycle analysis. In the case of aviation fuels, thus far, they've been in an advantaged position where no obligations have been imposed relative to aviation fuel, but the fuels are able to opt in and generate credits, and that creates an additional revenue stream. Both the RFS and the LCFS start with life cycle analysis. Just want to emphasize again how critical this is, and I think how critical cross-border communications on this is. We really need to get the science right. We need to drive consensus. We obviously sometimes will have competing trade interests and competing perspectives on what feedstocks are sustainable out there, what the land use change impacts are, and those need to be taken seriously and addressed hopefully in a scientific manner and in public forums, and also with an approach that evolves over time as our understanding of the science evolves, and also as best practices emerged with things like climate smart agriculture, double cropping, other opportunities to increase yields and so forth from a feedstock perspective. We don't really have time to drill into the different models, but what I'll say at a very high level is sort of the backbone model in the US was developed by the Department of Energy, Argonne National Labs, and is known as Argonne GREET. And it is a life cycle analysis that I think is continuing. It was really the first, and it's emerging, I think, is the most important, certainly on a national basis. And now that we're seeing more attention paid to climate policy in the United States, and we're seeing value attached to carbon intensity, the importance of these models is becoming all the more important. We've heard about that in the clean hydrogen space, in the e-fuel space, and certainly in the biofuel space as well. Just very briefly on the RFS front, this really was driven initially primarily by energy security issues, and it also was seen as an opportunity to support jobs and economic development and agriculture, and so it is a long-term program that dates back all the way back to 2007 and continues in existence today. We have the different RIN categories. These are sorted here in terms of what greenhouse gas reduction they have to achieve. So this was really the first transportation fuels program where greenhouse gas reductions were recognized for what are known as D6 RINs, renewable fuels. 20% reduction is required for advanced fuels and also for biomass-based diesel. A 50% reduction is required, and for cellulosic fuels, a 60% greenhouse gas reduction is required there. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the growth of the market in terms of cellulosic fuels that we had hoped to. You can see that these are just RIN market fluctuations that depend on multiple factors. So these are not fixed rates in terms of the revenue stream. To some degree, that's somewhat of a challenge for producers in that rather than having a fixed rate of what they know the incentive value is, it is variable. Switching over to the low carbon fuel standard, this was pioneered here in California. And was a concept of essentially decarbonizing step by step, typically about 1% a year. And it has been extremely successful in moving the needle forward. California starts with GREET analysis, but as we like to say in California always likes to change things and make them specific to California. So we have California GREET here in California, and indeed we also have now Oregon GREET and Washington GREET. And you can see that curve shows how over time carbon intensity reductions are required by the program. And then we see variable credit values depending on what that carbon intensity number is and also what the market price is. So like the RFS, this is another market-based program that moves up and down with demand for the fuels in terms of the value that's available. The California LCFS has generated now well over $10 billion in credit value, and that credit value is essentially recognizing the value of the environmental attribute. It's flowing to the credit generators. It's essentially supporting substantial investment. This is the remarkable diversification that's happened in the California fuel market in terms of new renewable fuels entering in the market, driven by the combination of the RFS and the LCFS. And we can see now heavy market penetration by electricity. We're up above 20% in terms of new vehicles being purchased, EVs. And looking into the diesel space, we've actually reached the point in California where fossil diesel is less than 50% of the fuel pool, and biodiesel and renewable diesel are the dominant fuels when combined in the marketplace. And we've seen both the Phillips 66 and the Marathon refineries switch over from conventional petroleum refineries to renewable diesel refineries. They're in the process of doing that. And World Energy, which is actually where the place that I started my work in this area, has the Paramount facility, which was previously an asphalt plant, and now is the leading SAF producer in the United States. Looking forward with CARB, they're in the midst of a rulemaking right now that would extend these carbon intensity reductions over time. And we look out to 2045, we see we get all the way down to a 90% CI reduction out there in a long-term time frame. So that's really moving the needle from a overall approach, and once that rulemaking is complete, we think we're going to see the market values pick up, and again, things accelerate. As I said up front, we've got a real patchwork out here. We have actually 2 phases in the federal blenders tax credit that was part of the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed. The first 2 years of the program, it ranges from $1.25 to $1.75. Again, there's a carbon intensity metric that ratchets the value up. And then it becomes the Clean Fuels Production Credit, and the range is even broader, from $1 to $2 a gallon. And then in addition to that, we have state tax credits. These are different structures. The states have different ways of taxing market participants. And so some of these are refundable or not refundable. So there's a kind of devil in the details thing, but you can see between these multiple policy structures, we're now talking about $1, $2, $3, $4 per gallon in terms of additional revenue opportunities coming off of the incentive programs that can really tighten that gap. And that new state of play is recent, off the Inflation Reduction Act, and also off what I call the competition for SAF hubs that's happening in the United States, where the states are looking to become the places where SAF is available. California won that race in the early days, and now other states are competing. Right now is up in Washington State a couple of weeks ago, and Senator Billig, who has really been a pioneer, was talking about how Washington thinks now they're in the lead position, and they very well may be, with that RFS RIN value we've talked about, plus the blender's credit value, plus the Washington Clean Fuel Standard value, plus the Washington tax credit. But actually, the Washington tax credit has not yet arrived, because there needs to be a 20 million gallon facility, or a number of facilities that add up to 20 million gallons before we get that trigger. This is really a resource slide about the in particular, $245 million in fast SAF grants for speeding up infrastructure and the development of technology in the space that we have coming off the IRA. So when we take a step back here from this patchwork quilt, we see that technology neutrality is really essential. An all of the above approach, where we're looking to multiple feedstocks and technologies, enables success. We want to have stacking wherever possible to maximize the value, and we have to work hard within the states and internationally to get the carbon policies right out there. So very much appreciate the chance to be here today, and glad to turn it back to Professor Riley.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Graham. That was really interesting, really informative, and good to have some details there, as well as the kind of complexities of different states in the US, and the whole kind of SAF fueling hubs. I really appreciate the questions that have come in from attendees. I see that Rosalind and then our New Zealand speakers have jumped in and responded. Appreciate them and what they've done. That's been great. Do carry on posting to speakers. Emma and myself will endeavour to read them and summarise to the speakers. Unfortunately, Rosalind has had to leave us. We've asked her to come back if she's still able to. I can't see her on board. So I think what I'm planning to do, and then we're going to alternate Emma and myself, is kind of ask some general discussion questions. Some of the questions so far have been great in the details on the detailed presentation. I keep them coming in if you want one to a specific presenter. But I'm just going to ask a general one, which touches a bit on one that that was the first one in the chat that unanswered about the urgency of the issue. So last week we touched on the science policy gap. So we had kind of from a science perspective, a lot of the kind of concepts around carbon emissions and SAF and how to explain some of these mechanisms to the public and how the policymakers can do it. So I kind of wanted just to ask in turn, probably the New Zealand speakers and then Graham, how you find as a policymaker, one, communicating these kind of challenging, difficult concepts, and secondly, how you feel about the urgency to act. So, Maile, are you able to answer that verbally?
I can try. Cindy's probably better at it, being a policy
well,
person.
Either of you. Sorry, I don't know if you want to handball it.
Good. She can always jump on as well.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing from it, I come from more of an operational side on the innovation, the technology side, and I think one thing that often gets missed is just how challenging it is when a policy setting is made if it's not really how it plays out in the ground. So it's really important to make sure that from the operational perspective that we're feeding that into those policy decisions to get the right outcomes. I know I've talked to a lot of fuels people in New Zealand. These are including fuels asset managers at the airports who do a lot of their own number crunching, and they're scratching their head about how we're ever going to get there, and so I make sure they're in on those conversations, and we've brought in a good variety for the SAA, our Sustainable Aviation Aotearoa, which is a merge of our policy people and then our ground operational real world people, that, so that we get the best we can moving forward, but we're realistic about what we can achieve for our policy settings as well, and all the suite of policy options that we have. I don't know if Cindy wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, do jump in. Can the presenters put the cameras back on and accordingly as well, so we join you? And I do appreciate Graham's already typing an answer in the background to one of the other questions, so I know it's a bit of kind of trying to talk and do that as well. So Cindy, feel free to jump in with a response. That'd be great.
I'm so sorry, my connection cut out for a little bit when you were asking that question. Could you just repeat the
Okay, yeah,
summarize it?
sure. So last week we kind of were talking about the science policy gap came up quite a bit. So it was from yourself as a policymaker, one, how you come across to try and communicate difficult scientific concepts in the work you do, and secondly, and this follows on from Helen's question in the webinar chat Q&A, how you deal with the urgency that scientists are saying in how we need to move on climate issues.
I think, well, as a graduate policy advisor, I am also very new to this policy space, and it was very apparent to me, this gap between, the ideal and the best solution to decarbonize. Like you see the news and the world is burning and we need to decarbonize as quick as possible and things like that. But in the most realistic operational sense, you really have to think about what are the things that you can do to make sure and set our country up to reap those decarbonisation benefits in the long term. And I think that's sort of what we're trying to do with the SAF mandate as well. Although those targets look very small and incremental at the beginning, those decisions that you make early on is really going to set that market up for SAF deployment in the future. And I think you really have to remember that when you're making those policies. Yeah,
definitely. No, great answer. So Graham, from your perspective about the science policy, what's been your experience in communication and the urgency?
Yeah, well, it has. I'll say the positive side first, which is, that the United States has gotten a lot more serious about climate policy recently. As I think other jurisdictions have experienced, there can be, quite a high level of variability in terms of the dedication of different administrations to this, and we see really high variability between a state like California, that established a Global Warming Solutions Act in 2006 and has, charted a course to carbon neutrality in 2045, and other states that will remain unnamed that have done essentially no climate policy whatsoever. So it's really variable. We do have, I think, an important piece to mention in terms of providing perspective, is the SAF Grand Challenge that President Biden and the administration have been supporting and is sort of woven in behind the Inflation Reduction Act, sets a goal of 3 billion gallons a year by 2030 of SAF production in the United States. And that's, a little bit less than 10% of demand. So that's quite a substantial ramp up from sort of 0.1% where we are right now, to get to 10% in a pretty short time period, and then getting all the way to 35 billion gallons a year by 2050, which would be all the conventional jet fuel usage. The only way we're going to get there is to keep working on the technology, keep working on the policies, and not have switch these policies on and off. We frankly don't have sort of a national consensus of urgency that's sufficient to rise to the problem from my perspective at this point, but we're at least moving in the right direction.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question now. I'm going to go to one that's been answered, but I think it's quite an interesting, thought-provoking one, and I'd appreciate the panel's thoughts on this. So we had a question around inbound tourist passengers as well, and including those emissions. So not just looking at domestic emissions, but also looking at international passenger emissions and flights. So I'd like to just start that off as Miley, you've already answered that question. If you'd like to just start, and then I'd really appreciate Graham's thoughts on that as well. Just your thoughts around that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We had only originally domestic emissions in our targets, and one of the things is around when do we include international. So we're working on that now, and we do think obviously they are going to come and they need to come, and then we can address it sort of in a more holistic way. But yeah, they hadn't been included in our targets, but we're looking to include them.
And do you know what difference that would make to your broader strategy and plans in terms of impact?
From which perspective?
Just the scale of the challenge, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, we welcome your views. This is it's clearly a challenge for everybody, and I think there's very few that are looking at that broader picture, but it's obviously a big part of the puzzle. So
yeah,
I can jump in, Marley.
Yeah, go for it, Cindy.
I think international aviation emissions are projected to be about 80% of our total aviation emissions. So domestic actually only makes up 20% of our aviation emissions in New Zealand, and that's just a reflection of how much we rely on aviation for connectivity with the world, whether it be tourism or our exports and imports. Yeah, so definitely a big challenge, but I think there's an increasing recognition that if we want to make some good change in the decarbonisation efforts, that we do need to start counting international aviation emissions. And that advice will come from the Climate Change Commission at the end of 2024, I think.
Thank you. Graham, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that on two levels. First on the California policy, which I think is most focused on achieving greenhouse gas reductions against a specified goal. They're looking now at imposing obligations on the airlines for intrastate travel in this rulemaking that's going on right now. And the question is, well, sort of how do you figure that out in California? And at least what was most recently discussed by the CARB leadership is essentially looking at the inventory for whatever jet fuel is being burned as the jet crosses California airspace, so to speak. So that would be, that's thought of as the greenhouse gas inventory for the state. And so that's how California is thinking about these issues. If you switch over to the federal side, the SAF Grand Challenge and all those programs that I talked about don't involve mandates. They don't involve specific emission reductions. They involve production of SAF and essentially making that SAF available. So that's just kind of the policy structure that's being utilized at this stage, and obviously kind of the policy structure that's possible on a federal level at this stage.
Thanks. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, the difference, Graham, between the federal and the state. I mean, I've kind of come from a geography-based background, and I'm interested in this whole Aviation Reimagined, trying to find international best practice. And it was fascinating for me hearing from New Zealand and the US, where I've not been that often, and aware that there is some really great best practice, and both sets of presenters have kind of come onto that in a way. But I think if you were to say what would be the best practice lessons from your place you are, whether New Zealand or, I don't know, Graham, if you want to say California or the US as a whole, what would be the best practice that you would particularly relate to an international audience for their jurisdiction? So I'll probably again start with New Zealand speakers and then go on to Graham. Maylee, do you want to start? And then over to Cindy. Sorry, I do it in that order all the time. I'm happy to swap round. I don't mind.
Best practice for us. To be honest, I'm not sure.
You certainly seem further ahead than Australia, if I should say, in some ways. Certainly the coming onto a Jet Zero equivalent and that kind of policy side of things, you seem quite well advanced on the policy side. Do you sense that yourselves in New Zealand, and I also sense as an outsider that the bit more environmental from the New Zealand people, that there's a bit more environmental feelings or willingness to do things. Is that fair as an outsider on both those elements?
Yeah, I think that's fair. We've always sort of prided ourselves on, clean, green New Zealand. And I think we have on the renewables and the electricity, we've always been, like I said, in an advantage because of that. But I think there's a lot to do, especially agriculture. We sort of always had this image that wasn't quite true if you looked at the numbers. And I think but New Zealanders have got a great desire to get there and to live up to that. Yeah. And I think I saw one of the comments earlier around, we're bringing in these initiatives, but maybe not any initiatives to move away from fossil fuels. But I would say that's maybe a little, little incorrect there. Certainly New Zealand has closed down its oil and gas industry. It's closed its refinery. That was the point of MB having a just transitions team come in, as we're looking at those regions that were largely oil and gas and looking how do we translate that workforce into what we need to be for the future. Things like offshore wind, onshore wind, hydrogen production. So we're looking at the skills we need. How do we get that as part of our curriculum and our polytechs to, upskill the workforce and enable a just transition to where we want to be. So New Zealand's definitely making steps. We've offered then a clean car discount, for anyone purchasing hybrids and electric vehicles. So we're bringing in a lot of initiatives. There's a lot of government investment, including transitioning at the moment coal burners for industry away from coal and into other boilers. So yeah, I think there's a lot of investment to slowly transitioning as best we can, but also not to the point where we suddenly have a shortage. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have all the charging networks. We don't have everything we need. So it needs to be in a I think, a methodical, well thought out way.
Yeah. Cindy, have you got anything? So the other thing, I mean, as an outsider, I'm aware that there's a general election going on in New Zealand. I've lost track of it.
Yeah.
How high have environmental issues been in that election? Is it something the main parties are agreeing on? Is it a point of difference? Is it at the front? And how, in your policy work, and I know that from dealing with like politicians and the actual work, it can often be slightly different. You kind of have this period where you're not doing much because you can't because of election, and then you're carrying back on. Has that impacted what you do, or how you sense it might change environmentally depending on who wins or where it's structured?
The last couple sort of big climate or environmental conferences that were in New Zealand, where the parties did turn up to give their position, and there was very little difference other than the speed of doing things. So to be honest, yeah, it was about rolling it out and how fast you'd roll it out. There was really only one party that had suggested pulling back the targets altogether, but the main parties were all on board together, and we don't expect that to really change. If there was a change in government, is that we're seeing the same rhetoric from all of them, is that this is important and meeting those targets is important.
Good. That's good. As an outsider and someone who's keen to see it progress, Jenny, that's great to hear. So Cindy, have you got anything to add on to? Sorry, I've always come to you second, and you have to kind of jump in and find the difference. But have you got anything to add on best practice you sense from New Zealand in this space?
No, I'm just happy to go second, by the way. Gives me time to think about things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would agree with Marley, and just reiterating the point that New Zealand feels that we're quite well placed to chase these technologies and sort of be a leader in sort of driving the change that we want to see in terms of sustainability. So like Marley said, we do have really high renewable electricity generation, which makes us well placed for, exploring things like hydrogen and electrification of previously very hard to abate sectors. I guess the other thing is we've got a lot of short-range domestic flight routes in New Zealand, and I was coming out of discussion with Air New Zealand the other day. That makes us a really great market to test their electrified flights or hydrogen flights that they're developing, which is one of the reasons that they're pushing it forward in New Zealand. So I think there's a recognition that we do want to live up to this clean green image, and that we do have the resources available to push that forward.
I think I'll actually just touch on, there's just a question come in from Yvonne about what are New Zealand and Australia doing to transition to fast rail and moving away from aviation. Certainly there's not much happening in Australia on unfortunately, from my take on rail. Is there been much push in New Zealand on rail as an alternative to aviation?
It's still looking at the real push then, like Cindy said, is our short domestic routes. If we could solve it through the hybrid aircraft, still the fastest way to get there than the large infrastructure costs for putting in rail. Yeah.
And coming from surface transport before, I'm aware of the geography and the of trying to connect with rail and the huge cost of it as well. So going back to my original question, Graham, I kind of was trying to look for best practice coming out. And you can ask this from a California or a US perspective. I quite liked you kind of the competition almost between states and kind of that mechanism that you can try and generate movement forward by kind of getting states to compete. And what would you say is kind of best practice coming out of what you're doing internationally that others could learn from?
Well, yeah, I would start with California and point out that there's a real history in California of focusing on air quality as a matter of necessity, because California's got sort of the best smog conditions you can find just about anywhere, particularly down in Los Angeles and within the Central Valley, where you have just really good smog formation, or really bad smog formation would be another way to look at it. And so we typically have 7 or 8 of the 10 worst air districts in the country or in California, even though California has all of these strictest regulatory requirements that have been empowered by statute on a federal level because of California's unique challenge. And so that sort of put California in that that leadership role. And I think what California's been doing well, that now we see this administration picking up on, is saying, you know, this is typically the transition to cleaner fuels and vehicles is portrayed as more costly, as potentially negative for consumers out there, as perhaps unrealistic. And there's a lot of resistance to it typically, and California has looked at the upside in terms of technology development and job development and air quality improvement, and being part of the the next wave of technology, the next type of energy usage, and I think we've seen that now through the Inflation Reduction Act and these other programs, the SAF Grand Challenge on the federal level, that the U.S. Is starting to think that way also. And I think that competition that you were mentioning between states, Tim, is also happening on an international level now with SAF. And, you know, the other things that I'd add in terms of best practices really is this emphasis on the science and on really robust process to go through and make these determinations about things like land use change, and that's a real challenge because there's a lot of sort of quick and easy talking points that aren't necessarily supported by data and evidence that people just latch on to, and we're really not going to be able to decarbonize like we should if we don't do the math and science all the time and evolve that as we learn more and do things better out there.
Yeah, definitely. Emma, you want to jump in?
Yep. I'm just playing with my video in the background there. So I have a question here that's a little bit contentious, I suppose, for the aviation sector more broadly, because this is one of kind of degrowth or steady state. We've had not just questions this time, but also questions last time around, are we doing enough? And, you know, should we actually be having much harder percentage reduction targets for the aviation sector and more broadly to make sure that we meet the targets required? And last week, as you know, we had quite a bit of science that's looking at the deep science and what's happening with the climate, and that we really need to be acting far more rapidly. So with that in mind around degrowth and flying less, I'd just like to kind of get your own perspectives and thoughts around, should we be giving up flying for the sake of the climate, or certainly rethinking that whole kind of flight thing, and what are we doing in that space around consumer decision making? So perhaps just to shift it around a little bit, I might start with you, Graham, if that's okay. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess there's an ethical question that we can all ask ourselves about what our own carbon footprint should be. But then, as someone who sort of lives in the policy realm, you know, where I go to is, well, you know, what can we get people to do out there, you know, at scale? And so, you know, certainly respect folks that make you know, the best possible greenhouse gas decisions and reduce their carbon footprint. But, you know, until we move the masses into decarbonization, then unfortunately we're not going to get where we need to go.
Miley?
And I guess I'll just sorry, I just felt like I needed to add, and in the US we're nowhere near, you know, having critical mass around. I mean, we've had this huge fight over high-speed rail. Even here in California, it's been very seriously resisted, and I think and people are absolutely still attached to their automobiles and their pickup trucks and their SUVs, and so we've got a long way to go on that, and in the aviation space. At least in the immediate term, I think the ramp up of SAF makes a great deal of policy sense as the scale solution right now.
Thanks, Graham. Miley?
Yeah, I think I would say just to put a little perspective around it, is that aviation is one of the smallest contributors to carbon emissions out of all the industries, and it's certainly the smallest in New Zealand. It's only 6% of our emissions. So sometimes the question is actually, why are you working so hard then to abate aviation if it's such a small percentage, and agriculture and industry and all of others are, far greater emissions. And the point that we made was it's in hard to abate industry. And if the easier ones start to change as they are, then the percentage of that contribution will just go up and up for aviation. That's why we're tackling it. But I just want to put that perspective in there as not, on the whole global scale of emissions, aviation is actually small. I know even as a government department, we look at our carbon footprint now. And I think one thing COVID taught us was how good we are at Zoom and Teams. So now the idea is, I do almost no traveling for work now. And pre-COVID, I was almost, because I'm based in Auckland, our major city, but our capital is obviously Wellington. I used to go down there weekly. I think I've been to Wellington in the last 2 years 3 times. So we definitely account for now, do you have to be there in person, or is this something you can hold over a Zoom? And I think I hear that from business too, from private industry, is that everyone's starting to look like where the benefit is in those face-to-face and those great interactions where you need to be there. But also if you are going to go there, what else can you tack on to make the most out of that trip, because we're being more conscious overall. And I think that's going to spread, and it is spreading to people are considering now, what they do with their lifestyle. But the other thing is, I guess, as fuel starts to move away from fossil fuel and the big cost increase, what's it actually going to cost to fly on a dollar term, not even an emissions term? And is that going to change behaviours as well? If it suddenly got a lot more expensive, and we are seeing even in New Zealand, we used to, pre-COVID, we got a lot of deals on the airlines, fly to the Pacific Islands, fly to Australia. Well, those are no longer, they're far and few between, those deals. And so you're now seeing people that maybe did 3 trips a year down to 1 already. And that can be just purely from the economics of it. So I think we've got sort of multiple things happening at once, but I think overall, yeah, we're going to have to see, are people willing for those behavioural changes, and are they going to be also forced on you due to economics and cost as well?
Thanks, Miley. And Cindy, did you want to add anything to that?
I was going to bring up the COVID point, which is interesting because Marley and I were talking about this the other day. I came into the workforce when Zooming was the norm. And so it's strange to me to hear before people used to fly everywhere. I think my 2 cents would be that having these discussions, is flying really necessary on an individual and behavioral level is super important, getting people to talk about it, raising the public awareness. But we do need those overarching policies that will help decarbonize these hard to abate sectors. So I think they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it is a challenging one. And I think it's one that people, it is at the back of people's minds. There's a lot going on now around high and low value travel, and, making sure that the travel that we do is in that high value category. I'm going to hand over to Tim now, who I think is going to wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Okay. I just want a quick one to Graham, actually, because the last one that is on technology, and there's one left open on from Anonymous, is what technological developments would you wish to increase SAF production? And is the efficiency of converting biomass into SAF sufficient? What would you love to see in that space, technology wise?
Yeah, well, from a really self-interested perspective, being in the foothills of Northern California in a high-risk wildfire district, I'd really like to see woody biomass gasification coming off all the wildfire risk management we need to do here, and that's we have essentially a lot of that going up in smoke in burn piles right now. And then we had our worst year ever, I believe, in 2021, when we had an estimated 100 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions that went up in wildfires. And so that would gasification is some and pyrolysis and all other technologies, both for the woody biomass and also for other waste streams, and figure out as much as possible how to expand those waste streams and make sure, you know, those tend to be the more capital intensive and complex technologies to deal with the more difficult feedstocks, the unconventional feedstocks. So really looking forward to those getting off the ground.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. That's great. Succinct. All right, we're going to wrap it up today.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for the last question. And yeah, thanking you all for joining us, in particular our speakers, and for joining us from all over the world today. Next week's webinar is going to be Climate Ready Aviation, Industry Perspectives and Practice. And we hope you enjoyed today and can join us next week. And if you have any feedback, please do get in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much to the speakers.